morning, everyone. It's Thursday morning. You made it almost there. So I want to thank you all for being the last one standing here. I want to tell a little story before I get going. We've got a lot of content today. We're going to be flying through this. Before I started, I wanted to tell a story. So last year, I gave a similar session, but I had the Wednesday afternoon slot before the celebration, and I made this joke about closest I'll ever come to opening for Elton John. So then I did that session, and then they bumped me to Thursday morning, so I'm kind of thinking that maybe that's a demotion, but I'm just going to ask you for mercy when it comes to survey time, so maybe you can help me out. All right, so again, before we get going, just a reminder, we do have the WebEx space for this session. I won't be doing any live Q&A because we're going to be going content start to finish here. But if you do have any burning questions, I've got a couple of folks from my team in that space moderating. They'd be happy to answer any questions live, and of course, if they don't get to those, I'll be monitoring the space till the 13th, and I'll make sure to get any questions answered. Okay, so obviously the name of the session is Demystifying the World of Passkeys. So if you are here, you are likely here to learn about passkeys, and we're going to do just that. I'm going to take you through what is and what makes up a passkey. We're going to cover off the usage, the storage, the security around them. We're going to be reviewing the types of passkeys and the types of implementations and the states of those. Then we'll discuss a little bit about passkeys in the enterprise, kind of what controls we have around those. And then we'll explain how Cisco products implement passkeys, and we'll do a wrap-up. Just really quickly about myself, I'm Clayton Ballreich. I'm a solutions engineer here at Cisco Systems. I've been in the IT industry for almost 20 years, about 10 years in IT security, and 6 of those years I've spent protecting end users, specifically around end user authentication, and I've helped secure hundreds of thousands of users. So again, a little story for you. My first experience with passkeys wasn't the greatest, and that's why I actually created this presentation, is because I got on a website, and the first time I was ever offered a passkey, I was like, oh, cool, what's this thing? I did a little research, did a little reading, and said, oh, great, I can use this for multi-factor authentication. So I went ahead and registered my passkey, or I attempted to do so at least, and I scanned my QR code, and I got this error, and I'm like, what the heck is going on? Well, come to find out, I wasn't using the right type of passkey for the site, and I started out very optimistic with a lovely hairline like this gentleman here, and at the end of it, you can see kind of what I'm rocking now, so it was a bit frustrating. And in fact, I could generate this basically barrage of experiences when I went to register with one single site. So throughout the different options that I could use, I could create over 12 different dialogues for one single site to sign up with a passkey. It's no wonder that this stuff is super confusing and it's hard to understand sometimes. But don't worry, we are going to break this all down. That's the point of this session. We're going to get you to the point where we're understanding all these different dialogues, how they can come up, and how we can use these passkeys, kind of demystify that, as well as help you understand it, learn it, and then explain it to others. All right, and before I get in, I want to just take the time to cover up a few definitions and terms. So has anybody here ever gone through the WebAuthn specifications? Have you ever read that? Okay, it's pretty brutal, right? There's a lot of text on that page. There's a lot of definitions in there, and I'm going to kind of distill that up to a few key ones. And I don't necessarily need you to memorize all this stuff, but I just kind of want to let you know what they are, so when they come up, we kind of know what we're talking about. So the first off is client or client platform, and the term client WebAuthn land is it can be used a bunch of different ways. So typically when I'm referring to a client, especially during this presentation, I'm talking about the client platform, which is all of the client things that the end user is going to be interacting with outside of the authenticator. And that can be a client device, a browser, it can be end user hardware. Then we have the discoverable credential, and what that means is it's also called resident key or residential key, so if you hear that term, it just means that a passkey is something stored with a user ID or metadata along with it. Then we have attestation, which is really designed to prove the make, manufacture. It proves the validity of origin. User verification is the process of verifying a user through mechanisms like who they are or what they know. It's not the process of verifying that they're present. So I just want to kind of stipulate that. You'll see how that will come up in just a little bit. Then we'll talk about bound, which means kind of where a passkey can be tied. Can it be bound with a single authenticator or multi-authenticators? We typically would talk about bound, we mean tied to a single authenticator. Attachment means what is the physical attachment, right? So do we have a authenticator that could be on the platform itself, meaning built into your computer, or is it a roaming authenticator that can kind of move between devices? And then we'll talk about backup eligible, which just means multi-device eligible. It can be literally backed up and then used somewhere else. So I'm starting off kind of explaining the definition of what is a passkey by using this quote from William Brown. And we're going to really distill it down to its simplest form. And what a passkey really is, it's eloquently said here by William. He said, the first definition of what is a passkey is all possible WebAuthn authenticators. Now, if we expand on that definition a little bit, passkeys are technically, you can think of them as a replacement for the password. They're a credential. So that's the simplest way to kind of describe it. Then if we expand upon that, if you're talking about a true passkey, it's something that typically can be synced. It can be sent securely to, from one device to another device and used in multiple different ways. And then if we have a discoverable credential, which is also in the true definition of a password, it means that it can have additional metadata. We can actually look at a passkey and we can look at information around that, like the username, which if we have the username and we have a replacement for the password, we can do a completely end-user interaction-less flow for authentication, meaning they don't even have to type in the username. And also, of course, it presents a choice, which if you have multiple passkeys registered, we can do a lookup. So if you're on a particular website trying to use passkeys, we can actually display to the end user all of the credentials that are available for that website. All right, so some of the technologies that make up passkeys are really foundational to understanding basically how they can be used and what they can be used for. And I'm going to cover off a couple different ones here. We're going to start with kind of definition of a couple different organizations, and then we'll go into, I'll break down some of the acronyms, because at Cisco we hate acronyms, right? All right, so first off are a couple different organizations. The first is the Fast Identity Online Alliance, and that is also known as FIDO. So when you hear a lot about passkeys or authenticators, you hear this term FIDO, and a lot of times it's used to describe the authenticator itself. So you may hear something like FIDO2. But FIDO is really the alliance that builds some of the underlying technology, and they're responsible for CTAP, and so that's CTAP1 and CTAP2. Now, there's also another technology, as I already kind of peeked into that, called WebAuthn. And WebAuthn was created by the W3C, which is an organization that created its standards. Now, these two organizations are actually really cool because it's a perfect example of basically people coming together throughout the technological world, putting down their differences. So regardless if they sell competing solutions or sell different solutions, they're coming together to create an authentication standard that is bettering the entire world and making authentication both more secure and easier to do. And in fact, you can see some of the contributors to both these organizations: Cisco, Google, Microsoft, Apple, IBM. And in fact, we have people on staff at Cisco that actually contributed to a ton of this work. And in fact, some of their work is written within the specifications of these two different technologies. So you might be thinking, okay, what the heck is WebAuthn? What the heck is CTAP2? Well, I call that a great segue because we're going to explain that now. So WebAuthn is actually an API at its roots. It's the ability it allows servers to register and authenticate users. It brokers communication between the client and the server. It uses public key cryptography, and it's backwards compatible with CTAP1. Okay, what the heck is CTAP, right? So CTAP is the client to authenticator protocol, and basically what it does is it brokers the communication between the client and the authenticator. So it does all that work. Again, there's two flavors, CTAP1 and CTAP2. CTAP1 was really designed for multi-factor authentication. So it was riding alongside some primary credential, typically something like a username or password, and then it just allows you to interact with something like a security key in order to do a second factor. So now we get this expansion on that called CTAP2, and CTAP2's job is to really do kind of passwordless authentication. Because what it does is it allows us to do an extra verification step on the end user. So you have the credential, you have the authenticator, that's the something that user has, and now we move to the other two elements, possible elements of multi-factor authentication, which is the no or R of the end user. So CTAP2 is the protocol that allows for that. FIDO2, very simply, is WebAuthn plus CTAP2. That's how you can break it down. And so if you're hearing about a FIDO2 authenticator, it just means it has the capability to work with the WebAuthn API and interact with its components via CTAP2. And if you have a passwordless authenticator, most of those passwordless authenticators meet the FIDO2 standard because they're doing just that. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to do passwordless authentication just verifying a user's primary credentials, right? So passwordless authentications and the mechanisms and the ways that we use them today are inherently multi-factor authentication. All right, so now we're going to kind of dig in. So again, the WebAuthn spec has just a ton of information around all these different components and pieces that make the authentication and registration flows possible. So I kind of wanted to dissect this a little bit. You'll hear some terms like relying party. Relying party just means it's the server applications, the application that runs on the server. So that's pretty much the website that you're logging into or interacting with, the service that you're trying to use. And then you've got the client platform. So I mentioned that whole client piece. If you're talking about client specifically with WebAuthn, if you look in the specification, what client really is basically the code doing the client side work. And that code runs within a user agent or a browser. So not a lot of people, when they say client, are specifically talking about the actual functions that run to explain WebAuthn. But developers do see that, and developers understand the difference and the importance of that. But for you all, definitely perfectly fine to think of the client as the client platform. So then you have included that in that is the client device, and that would be where a user agent is running. So the client code is a part of the user agent application, and that is running on a client device. And very simply, everybody can think about this, is it's just your laptops, your desktops, your mobile phones. They're running a web browser, and that web browser is running the client code to interact with the server to do the work. And then the last piece, certainly not least, is the authenticator. And there's really two flavors of authenticator. One is platform and one is roaming. So platform would be something physically tied into your client device. And that would be something we commonly would see as like Windows Hello or something on a Mac like Touch ID. And then our roaming authenticators would be probably what a lot of people think of when they think of security keys or something that could be going between multiple different devices. And those security keys, or those typically roaming authenticators, usually communicate with the end client device over that CTAP protocol using transports like USB, NFC, and others. All right, so you can see like a little square in there. That's for secure storage. It's just an honorable mention about secure storage. We're going to go into the security around passkeys and how all that stuff works. But whenever we generate a passkey on an authenticator, we always store it in secure storage. So that way it's tamper-proof, it's secure. We want to make sure that those credentials don't leak. OK, so how are passkeys secured, stored, shared, and used? So the security. Of course, I love security, right? And there's tons built into WebAuthn, to Passkeys, to basically this technology as a whole. First off is Passkeys are built on public key cryptography. So we have asymmetric key pairs getting generated. We all know the security of asymmetric key pairs right now. And I know some of the folks might be thinking supercomputers in the back of your mind. All right, give me a break on that one, right? But seriously, for now, this is the technology that we use to secure all of our, our web traffic, right? And they're unique per user, per relying party. So what's really cool about that is on each relying party you go to, you actually generate a unique credential, and that's not usable on other sites. So that was the problem with the passwords, right? Passwords were difficult to manage, so our end users were go ahead and creating them and just basically recycling the same password everywhere. But with passkeys, they're unique. So if one does manage to get stolen, it can't be stuffed into another service. There'll be kind of a small exception to that we'll talk about when we get to the federation piece. But for the most part, that holds true. So that's really great for end user security. They are phishing resistant by default. There are specs, there are mechanisms built into the WebAuthn API that help make them phishing resistant. We're going to go deeper into that because that's such an important topic. They are inherently MFA. So hopefully you kind of picked up on why that is. But we are having something you have, the credential, the authenticator, and then we have the what you know, what you are. So those elements combine to mean multi-factor authentication. And when you're using passwordless authentication, that is it's just done automatically for the end user. Of course, secure storage, I had mentioned that. But what that, where we're doing that is typically something that's tied to the authenticator. So for instance, if you have a Mac, you've got secure storage, secure enclave. If you've got Windows, you've got the TPM. And that's actually where we're storing the private keys of the equation, is we're storing that in those secure storage so that way it's tamper resistant and for the security of the passkey. They allow for manufacturer validation where possible. And I kind of want to stop off at this topic and just let you know that if you look within the WebAuthn specification, you will see a ton of privacy things. Basically, we'll talk about how we don't allow passkeys to be tracked. Well, we basically don't give a lot of user metadata around passkeys because they preserve privacy. Well, enterprises hate that. Because like most of us, sign some type of an agreement and we go to our employer and it basically says like, we can watch you, we can monitor you, we can do things like that. And the reason why they're doing that is because they want to protect you, they want to protect their assets. So there's a little bit of a conflict there, and we'll stop off in the attestation section. We'll go kind of deeper into that and explain a little bit of that conflict, but there are some controls that are available to help enterprises do some level of control. They use secure communication channels. Inside the WebAuthn specification, it basically says, hey, you better be running this stuff on TLS. There's actually some small exceptions to that, like localhost and some other things, but for the most part, it's meant to be run on an underlying, basically, layer that secures those communications. And then finally, again, the privacy. We'll stop off. We'll talk about that during the attestation section. All right, phishing resistance. So last year I used an analogy of a cheeseburger, and you can think about phishing resistance as a cheeseburger. This year I'm going to switch it up to pizza because that's really my number one love. So first I have we've got our crust. It can be thick crust or thin crust. We won't get into that debate today. Whatever you prefer is fine. Maybe stuffed crust. All right, so first layer is going to be our first layer of phishing resistance, and that's going to be around what the browser does to protect the end user. So the browser rejects any invalid relying party ID for the site's origin. And what I kind of mean about that, don't have to worry about what an origin is as a relying party necessarily, but we know what the relying party is, right? But the browser has a URL, like we go to a website. So during the communication between the server and through the API calls, basically, the relying party is coughing up its natural ID. It's basically saying, I am this website. And the browser then goes and checks the URL bar, and it's like, is that where the user truly is? So when those bad actors spin up those reverse proxy attacks and take your users to a false website and they're streaming the real one, that's not going to work because the browser's got a mechanism to check on that. All right, so now we're looking at kind of the cheese. And now there's like a nacho cheese pizza out there too. So like, your cheese preference is fine too, either way. And that's your authenticator comparing the relying party ID of a list of credentials. So basically, the credential has the ability and stores the relying party information along with that credential. So the authenticator, when it gets requested to serve up the credentials, it's only going to cough up the credentials for the appropriate relying party. And then, of course, the authenticator signs data with the private key. That's why we're using that PKI stuff. And it only happens if there's an origin match. So that's another kind of layer, maybe with extra keys. And then finally, the relying party checks all that information on the way back. And what does that during registration time, authentication time, to validate the data is exactly what it says it is. How that works, we'll talk about in just a little bit. But basically, you have now, that's your pepperoni. I'm a meat pizza guy, but it can be veggies too, whatever, no judgment. And that's your pizza altogether. So all those things combine together basically and layer in for phishing protection, so it's goodbye phishing. All right, so I want to stop off a little bit at public key cryptography and explain how the public key cryptography is used. So I think a lot of us understand what PK is and how basically should be used, but specifically within the passkey world, what happens is at registration time, the authenticator creates an asymmetric key pair. It stores its private key portion of information from the relying party into a public key credential source, and this information is stored on secure hardware with limited ability to extract. Of course, we have the opposite side of that, which is the public key, and we'll take that public key and use it. So the public key portion is returned to the relying party, which then stores it with the active user account. So there's almost always a user account. There has to be, right? There's a reason why we use these. It's to access the user account and actually show you a demonstration of kind of what that looks like. But the relying party uses its stored copy of the credential public key to verify the resultant authentication assertion. So basically, it's just looking at the data that's returned back, making sure it actually sends some communication that should be signed, make sure with its public key that it was the private key that indeed did sign that communication. Okay, so how do we use passkeys? How does it work? How does the transport work? So we want to use passkeys instead of passwords because of two really cool ceremonies that allow passkeys to work. The first is the registration ceremony. And during the registration ceremony, what happens is the user basically goes into some service provider. They're typically already logged in at this point in time, and it usually is through some mechanism like an initial username and password. It doesn't have to be. There are other ways to do a passwordless registration, but that's our typical common flow that we see today. So they're basically landed within the service provider's website. And what happens is they have some kind of button, right? So some kind of user icon that they click that says register a passkey or add a security key or something along those lines. They click that, and then what happens is the client actually requests options from the server. So you remember that 12 dialogue piece that I showed you with all those different dialogues? That's happening because there are various different options that can be specified. And it can change the end user dialog based upon what those are. So for instance, I can say just use a platform authenticator or just use a roaming authenticator. So what happens is then, once those options are sent back, the server sends the options to the client, and it also sends along a challenge that needs to be signed. And that challenge basically helps with man-in-the-middle attacks, just make sure nothing gets replayed. If somebody unpacks that challenge has to be unmodified. So then at that point in time, the client calls the WebAuthn API with those options, and the authenticator actually reacts to the options. So for example, if I want to do a passwordless authentication, then I need to call those options with user verification. If I want to do just basic MFA, then just user presence is fine. So the authenticator then authenticates the end user. And then let's say I do have just a user presence, something like just like a blinking light to let them know kind of where to touch, or a little gold button, something like that. That's pretty common to see. But if you're doing passwordless authentication, you would typically see something like a biometric come up or a dialog to ask for a user PIN because you're verifying that second factor. Once the authenticator verifies the end user, it actually creates the key at that point, the key pair at that point in time. So it stores its private key locally, and it ships off the response back with the challenge signed, the public key, and then the credential ID, all that's signed. And then the credential actually gets sent through the client. The client's the one that does the work with the relying party. Then once all that happens, we got to have our server checking off all the boxes, again, all that phishing resistance, good stuff, to make sure that all that is valid. And then if it is, then the server's like, yep, we're good to go. Then, of course, the developers can show some type of dialogue to the end user that just says, congratulations, you're successfully registered. Now, if we look at passkey authentication, it's very, very similar. So there's not a whole lot of change here. So ultimately what we have is we have the user attempting to sign in. Now they're actually clicking the sign in with a security key or sign in passkey button or whatever that is. They're getting prompted to sign in with that passkey. And then the client requests the options from the server, same as before. Server sends options to the client, same as before with the challenge. Then what happens is the client calls the WebAuthn API with those options. The user is verified. So again, a lot of this process is still the same as registration time. User is verified. Authenticator sends a response containing the signed challenge. All that's good. Client sends the response back to the server. Server then checks the validity, and then at that point, a little bit different here, is now the end user is granted access to whatever they're granted. They're created, session tokens are created, whatever the developers need to do to service the end user and allow them to use the service appropriately. All right, so now that we've looked at the security, we've looked at basically how you can authenticate, we've looked at the ceremonies, I want to talk a lot about end user experience. And I love this quote by Shane Whedon. Shane's a senior technical staff member at IBM. Contributes heavily to Passkeys, WebAuthn, all that good stuff. Shane says so beautifully that the use of Passkeys is one of the very few times in the history of the internet that you get an improved end user experience and an improved security posture at the same time. I mean, you could try to just let that sink in. Think about all the security controls that we use today. Do they make the end user experience better? Not typically, right? Okay, so passkey usage. I wanted to show you a little bit of a demo. This gets pretty basic, but there's going to be some nuances that I want to point out that are happening now that everybody understands just all the mechanisms that are going on underneath the hood. So we're going to start here in this demonstration. The user is actually given two choices. They're giving the add a passkey and add a security key options. You'll see this. This is basically kind of what they're saying here typically is add a passkey tends to be a platform authenticator in a lot of cases, but it doesn't have to be. Ultimately, these two buttons could really do anything. It doesn't mean physical hardware security key because as we can see here, I'm about to use a security key that's not a physical hardware key at all. So here's the end user. Basically, they get in here, they go starting their authentication, and what we do with that here is the user is going to scan a QR code with a mobile device, right? That's not a hardware security key, but it allows us to store a passkey in a cloud service. So we can choose where to store that. The user is going to say, hey, I want to store this in Google, and now that's stored in their secure storage, right? So it's not your secure storage, it's theirs. But it is stored in a protected storage area, and then that end user is registered. So now once we click save, we're going to go ahead and do an authentication here. All I got to do is put in my username. I click next. I say use a security key or biometric. Then I'm prompted to authenticate on the mobile device. Then I do have to prove who I am, right? So multi-factor authentication happening there, and then they're in. So that was both the registration ceremony taking place and the authentication ceremony taking place. There's actually a lot going on there, right, when you think about it. But think about what just happened for the end user. They were able to register an authenticator and do an authenticator within a number of seconds, 15, 20 seconds for the whole process, start to finish. And that experience can get even better and even faster just depending on what type of authenticator they're actually using. Okay, so now we cover off a bit about the end user experience, and we'll go back to that in a minute once we lay a little bit more groundwork. We're going to talk about passkey implementation. So I want to tell just a brief story about, a true customer story that happened to me when I was supporting a customer. They came to me and they said, hey, Clayton, we'd like to have we're doing a project where we want to better our end user experience and make it more secure at the same time. That sounds familiar, right? So they decided to go down the Passkeys journey. Time frame just for you all, this was early 2022. So they get going, they understand, they kind of learn a little bit about Passkeys. Then from that point in time, they test out even what Cisco had at the time through Cisco Duo. They came back and they said, hey, we're not gonna move forward with Passkeys. Because at the time, they had a couple big concerns. One of which was the authenticators, if their end users lost that authenticator, it was like game over, right? They couldn't access their services, they're bombarding the help desk, they were super concerned about that. They were also concerned about the clicks. So we're talking about an organization that had actually millions of users, hundreds of thousands of users, and every single extra click for one end user, they figured out was a significant waste of time for their organization. So they said, all right, if browsers like Chrome are going to continue to change all the clicks, we're just not ready. The technology is not mature. We can't really implement that. But the good news is there's been a significant amount of evolution in this space since early 2022. So the first was synced passkeys. The ability to create a passkey and then sync it across multiple devices. So if you did lose a device that was your single authenticator and you had a synced passkey, you were good because that was probably stored in a cloud service and usable on another device. So that really helped with that concern about them losing the single authenticator. Then we had a couple other things happen. So the office of the president back in 2022, basically, they looked at it. They were like, "Yep, WebAuthn is strong technology, great security around that. Everybody should start using it." That helped. Then there was significant investment by major players like Microsoft, Google, Apple to add more pervasive support of passkeys within their systems. So kind of you see this evolution as we go through this, that there's just more support from those vendors. Firefox started to get on board, so now most of your major browsers are supporting passkeys. Then actually we had some of the platforms happening, so really good platform authenticators. Now moving into a space where whole ecosystems are able to sync passkeys. So like you register once in Apple, you can use it across all your Apple devices. Now Microsoft is actually on board with that. So they're actually in the midst right now. There's actually previews of Windows Sync passkeys. So you'll be able to do the same thing on the Microsoft side. So as you can see, we're just building up. Now we have the bones and foundations to have a really strong passkey implementation. And this is kind of a current-ish chart. I think this is about a month old. Special shout out to passkeys.dev/device support. It's a website that you can go to get the latest updated information on kind of what platforms, what applications, what vendors are supporting what. A lot of green on this chart, right? Like this chart used to be a lot of red. So now there's a lot of green on this chart. It's looking really good. Another cool resource here, honorable mention, is 1Password maintains a website called passkeys.directory. You can actually go there and you can see a lot of the sites that allow you to use passkeys. So if you're just doing that research and you're trying to look at what external providers, cloud providers, allow the supporting of passkeys, you can go to that website and check that out. So really cool resource there. All right, so now we get into the land of passkey providers. So really, what are passkey providers providing when they say, hey, I've got a passkey solution? So you can run out in there, and you'll see this all the time. We're starting to see this a lot, which is basically like something like a third-party password manager will want to manage your passkeys, right? So what does that truly mean? Well, I'd like to break this down, and this is like Clayton's unofficial scientific breakdown of how passkeys are provided throughout vendors, right? So the passkey providers are typically, I break them up kind of into first party and third party, and your first parties are really concerned around their ecosystem. So if you think about somebody like an Apple, Apple's main concern was to make sure that your passkey works across their devices, but they're not super concerned about your passkeys working on Windows. Same kind of thing for like Microsoft, same kind of thing for Firefox. But then you have your third parties, and your third parties are the complete opposite of that. So your third parties want to make sure that your passkey is used across all your devices. It's pervasive usage. All right, so that sounds pretty darn good, right? Like I can register on, let's say, an iOS device and use it on Android. Cool, good stuff, great. So that's kind of our benefit, right? They're good for that pervasiveness. But the bad part about that is it can create so many different experiences. So what I was doing in my 12 dialogue slide there was I was literally just ticking the boxes between different vendors, different ecosystem providers, and different passkey vendors or password vendors to create that experience. I mean, it was just changing a round of options. So it gives a lot of different options. But ultimately, everybody's doing the same thing at the end of the day, which is they're capturing, storing, and syncing those public key credentials. It's just what they decide to do with those and how they allow you to use them that changes. So I did want to go into a demonstration around this because I think this is a state that a lot of us are in now as we go through and we load a password manager, we actually start to use passkeys, we start to get these types of disjunct experiences. So here I'm actually going to do a demonstration where I'm on WebAuthn.io. A special shout out to this website. If you are on that passkeys journey and you're looking to just get going, take a stop off here. This website's fantastic. It actually allows you to change all the different options, see what all the different dialogues are, see how the keys are used. It helps you in understanding just things like attestation and the ability to manage keys. Absolutely great resource. So in this demo here, what I'm actually doing is I am going to basically play around with all the different options. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and pop my username in here. I'm going to click register. And then first thing, basically Apple comes up and it wants to manage my passkey. So I got to cancel out of that dialog. Then the browser wants to manage. So then I'm going to hop over. I'm going to change the setting here. I'm going to basically turn on iCloud Keychain and allow Apple to manage my passkey. Much better experience, right? Like no dialogue. I just touch ID and I'm in. So now let me go ahead and cancel out of this. It still falls back to the browser. I cancel again. Now I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, Google, why don't you manage my passkey? OK, so what does this experience look like? I turn that on. I hop back. I register again. I get a dialog again. And now notice I get the option to sign in with my Google account and save my passkey there. OK, I cancel out of that. And then I turn on my password manager. Now this experience gets pretty good, right? So no cancel button, ability to choose multiple profiles if I want. Now on my Android, I click in and I click sign in. Now notice what I didn't do there was I did not put it in the username. So because of the discoverable credential and that being stored in the password manager, I'm able to very quickly log in with the dialog. And also too, they can add additional options to use their verification steps there as well. And that gives me a pretty darn good experience. So if I'm going through as an end user and very quickly I'm using a password manager, I get not only the great platform experience, which I would have got with the Apple ecosystem natively, but I also get the cross-device experience that's also really good for the end user. So worry not, although there are lots of options through some configuration options, we can land an extremely good end user experience. All right, so what did we really just see? So what we saw was the multi-manufacturer competition to get your passkeys is creating a poor user experience, and it can create end user confusion. A lot of us in the room are technical, but a lot of our users who are going to use this passkey stuff are not. So we want to keep the number of dialogues down to a minimum. The OS passkeys option consolidation can happen. So basically, I can go into the operating system and I can just flip a box that basically says, hey, OS, manage all my passkeys. And that's what you saw with the Touch ID dialog. The experience got much better. It popped up the dialog right away. But again, I'm not getting that cross-ecosystem type experience. And then finally, I use that password manager who is not concerned about their ecosystem. They want to really just make it pervasive. And I'm able to go ahead and use that. Now, the other cool thing, too, is some of the operating systems are on the journey to making the experience better. So regardless of whether you want to use the platform of the ecosystem of that vendor or you want to use the password manager, they are now doing like consolidated dialogues like this, where it's very simple for the end user to choose that, as well as you see that even now coming on Windows with their release of their new APIs to allow kind of a consolidated view for the end user. So good news kind of on the operating system front that they're on their way to making the experience better. Okay, so now we're going to talk about passkeys at scale and in the enterprise. This topic gets pretty deep, so I want to just high level it by talking about basically what is available for you kind of at a high level, and you're starting to see more and more controls. So I have this blurb in here from Microsoft about supporting passkeys in the enterprise. Like they basically came back in like 2024, I think, and said there's like a heavy investment and commitment to support passkeys in the enterprise because they're seeing it a lot more. But they also had added additional controls around attestation. So now you have the ability to pop in some controls to say, hey, I want to only allow this specific make model of keys before I allow the user to authenticate. Then you can see this is a snippet of Apple Business Manager and the controls that they have. So they have the things that like they don't allow sharing of passkeys between end users. And these are the types of things that enterprise want, right? They want these level of controls for the end user. But again, it does go a little bit against some of the privacy concern stuff that's built into the WebAuthn specification. All right, so with that said, I do want to talk about attestation, what that is, how that works, and what it basically allows enterprises to do. Before I get into this topic, I'm just saying that a lot of this stuff is icing on the cake. I don't want to detract from the better end user experience, the really great security around passkeys, because none of this is trying to detract from that. That all holds true. So if that's the baseline, then that's our cake. Now we're talking about the icing. So what is attestation? Attestation is basically the ability to verify the make and model and manufacturer of a authenticator. Now, there are some exceptions to that. There are actually different types of attestation. We're talking about pretty basic attestation, where we're just going to look at that make and model. There is ability to do what's called enterprise attestation, kind of a newer in the FIDO spec. What it basically allows you to identify a specific authenticator. Because again, now we're really conflicting, because in WebAuthn, it basically says don't track the authenticator, right? But again, enterprises need those types of controls. So you can work with vendors, security key vendors, to make sure that they open that up. They give you a list of sites that your keys can work on, and then they provide additional information during the registration flows, like what is the serial number of that authenticator. So those controls do exist, and they are helpful for enterprises who need just a super, super high level of assurance. All right, so now kind of this eye chart, like what is this thing? So what I want to do here is just explain that we have some really good controls around attestation for those organizations that have a very low acceptance of risk. So they basically, they have to have super high assurance. They may have sensitive applications. They want to do things like create an allow list of authenticators. So basically, they want to know exactly what type of authenticators are authenticating, and may even go as far to say, we want to know the serial numbers of those authenticators who are authenticating on our sites. Well, here's the problem with that. How would I know what the serial number of the authenticator is if the passkey switches between authenticators? Well, I won't, right? A lot of this technology is for hardware-bound passkeys. So that means that something like a security key, where like the hardware just never changes. And you have to think about that in your security and your deployment to applications. This is a limitation of kind of the world that we live in with passkeys now. But all is not lost. There are other mechanisms that we can do to secure end user authentications and give high levels of assurance. Okay, but think about let's say you're an organization, you have some sensitivity in your applications. What do? Okay, well, maybe I want to create a deny list of authenticators versus an allow list of authenticators. So now I'm allowing most authenticators, maybe just not synced passkeys, but every other hardware-bound passkey. So I can do that with a less sensitive application. Now, if I move down to the list of authenticators, I allow and kind of a mid-level or low sensitivity application. Now I can start to open that up even more. Now I can start to consider sync passkeys, but maybe I just want to limit some characteristics of an authenticator. Then I move on down to a low or no sensitivity application. I have very low risk, or I have a high risk acceptance level. And then I say, yep, all WebAuthn authenticators are good. You can use a sync passkey site with sync passkeys with my site. I'm perfectly happy to do that. Cool. Now you may be thinking, well, how do I use sync passkeys with a highly sensitive application? Well, that's where a set of compensating controls come in. So you're no longer relying on the security built in to the passkey specification to basically make sure that your authenticator is good. Now, in government, maybe you have to have a high assurance level. If you're not in government, then you can start looking at some of these compensating controls to say, I want to look at elements of the authentication and not just the authenticator itself. So something like, I want to have a risk engine sitting there looking at the location of where my user is at, the device that they're coming in on. Is that device hygienic? All these different elements. And so the more elements you stack, the more assurance that you can get on that authentication. And then kind of as you move down your stack in sensitivity, you can lessen those controls. So you can say like, okay, maybe I only want to allow authentication from my managed device, but where they're logging in from, we don't really care, right? So as you slide down that scale, you just lessen those controls, okay? I did want to mention that if you are in the process of this evaluation, there are tons of really good guidelines. So like the NIST digital identity guidelines actually go through and give you basically some suggestions and help tell you how to look at the sensitivity of your applications, what assurance level you need on authenticators. So it's a great place to go for that type of information if you're just on that journey. All right, now, so federated versus non-federated. And I want to talk about this because a lot of people will say, okay, great, I want to use passkeys, but I also want to layer in one of those risk engines or a compensating set of controls for my authentications on my end users. How do I do that? And the answer is typically federation. Now, why is it federation? It's because with federation, we're allowed to take our service providers and basically take their authentications and move them to a centralized location. So now with federation, we're able to create a single set of credentials for the end user, which is great because if they leave the organization, then it's one spot. I just remove the passkey from that end user or disable their account. So that's great, right? Now we don't have to go to each application and make sure we do the same thing over and over. We get granular, consistent policy control. So if I do apply one of those risk engine policies, I can apply it globally across all those applications. And then also, too, I can do mobile or desktop application enforcement, meaning that I can do things like put an application on that device that speaks to my identity provider that reports back the health and the hygiene of that device, or even have an authenticator app on one of those devices that brokers the authentication and becomes the passkey provider. Now, there's some drawbacks. Remember when we were talking about the relying party and how each of those credentials is unique to that relying party and we get that phishing resistance? All right, so now think about this in your mind. If I put all of my applications between a single identity provider and I have one passkey at that identity provider, what happens? You remove the benefit that you get from native WebAuthn tying into a relying party, which means that there is a single credential. So if it is stolen, it can be stuffed. It can be reused at that identity provider and thus give access to all your applications. So that is a bit of a loophole that I just want to warn you all about when you do federation, that exists. Okay, cool. So relying party support, not consistent across identity providers, right? So every identity provider kind of treats passkeys different, but the cool thing about that is it's just getting better and better as time goes on, and most relying parties do support passkeys pretty well. Most identity providers support passkeys. We'll take a look at how Cisco does that kind of near the end. And then now, like, what's going on with like not federated to identity provider? Like, what state are we in? What's the good? What's the bad? Well, first off, you get back the protection for that end user on the relying party on the stuffing stuff because it's a unique credential per relying party. Okay, so that's back. But then you have to layer in the compensating control at each one of those relying parties, which is very difficult to do. So think about if you own an application or you write code for an application, you're responsible for putting in the security controls around that application. That becomes very difficult, especially if you have multiple different applications. So federation is kind of a better way to go about that. But again, it does protect the end user's credential a little bit better than the identity provider does. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Cisco product passkey implementation and what Cisco Systems is offering around passkeys. So what we're offering is Cisco has multiple different products that can utilize passkeys. Of course, Cisco Security is our authentication solution. It's our end user protection solution for all those cloud-based applications, on-premises applications, so on and so forth. And you can use passkeys to sign into the admin panel of Duo natively. You can work with Duo Single Sign-On and now Duo Directory to create users locally and create them with a full passwordless authentication experience, meaning they actually use the passkeys to sign in from end to end. They don't actually ever need a password, and that's really cool capabilities of WebAuthn and Passkeys at its core, allowing Cisco products to offer a no password experience for end users, which is absolutely excellent. And of course, we have policy-driven access within Duo as well. So you get that risk engine. You get the ability to look at the device hygiene. You get the ability to do device trust, all built within that product. So if you are leveraging those, you want to leverage Passkeys with any kind of service, you can federate to Duo as the identity provider behind that service and allow Duo to use WebAuthn and Passkeys to authenticate the end user. We can also do something very similar with Security Cloud sign-on. So Security Cloud Control now has the ability to leverage an identity provider. So you can federate to Duo or another identity provider, leverage those passkeys to authenticate. And when you do that, you're going to authenticate into multiple Cisco solutions. So something like Cisco Secure Access or XDR behind that Security Cloud sign-on will then just natively absorb the passkey usage through the identity provider, and you can sign in there as well. And then, of course, any Cisco product supporting SAML 2.0 identity providers can leverage the same thing. So think about your VPNs, so your firepowers, your ASAs, so on and so forth, that your Cisco Secure Access Cloud VPNs, that can leverage those cloud identity providers, hook up to those, and you get a great end user experience to sign into those applications or those ways to connect into the network as well. So really cool stuff there. All right, last bit of demonstration I want to do for you here is a Cisco product passkey usage demo. If you haven't seen this, I'm excited to show you this demonstration. Before I do, I wanted to mention that I hold the unofficial demo record for fastest demo at Cisco Live. So if you guys find a faster demo, let me know, but I'm pretty sure I win. All right. So we're going to start here. End user is going to begin. We're going to be logging in some Duo services here. So already here we go. Here's the demonstration. So the end user goes to sign in. They click sign in. They touch Touch ID, and they're signed in. Hey, how about that, huh? Fastest demo at Cisco Live, right? I joke around a little bit, but a lot was going on there. So what actually happened for the end user is the user went through multi-factor authentication. They used a risk engine, so we were looking at elements of their authentication to detect whether they were in the same location, whether they had an active phishing attack against them, and other elements. We also looked at the device they were authenticating on to make sure that was a device that we owned. And then, of course, we used absolutely no password throughout that flow. So think about all of that end-user security around what's going on there. There's only two components that we needed to do to allow that to happen, which was federate the end user and then have them leverage a passkey. And those two things combined created this extremely fast 2-3 second authentication experience with a ton of security behind that end user. All right, so in conclusion, what we did today is we defined what made up a passkey. We showed how passkeys are used, stored, shared, and security around them. We described the current passkey implementation types. We described the passkey usage in the enterprise and the controls around them. And then we covered up how Cisco passkeys are implemented. And with that, I kind of want to do a little bit of wrap up. Just thank you so much for attending the session today. You're almost there. You're almost home. I know it's been a long week, but you're almost there. Please do complete those session evaluations, though. It really, really helps us out. It helps you out as well because it helps shape the content of what we do at Cisco Live in the future, so I definitely recommend that. And then, of course, there are still some opportunities to continue your education. Visiting the on-demand library is one of those, so I know we had a ton of sessions at Cisco Live this year, but I do encourage you to go back into that library because all those sessions will be available for you recorded. You can download the PDFs of those presentations. And with that, have a great rest of your Cisco Live and a safe journey home. Thank you very much.